So last but not least, absolutely not least, is Mr. Jonathan Granoff, who is an author, attorney, and international advocate, and who emphasizes the legal and ethical dimensions of human development and security with a specific focus on advancing the rule of law to address international security and the threats posed by nuclear weapons. He serves on numerous governing boards and advisory boards, including Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, Fortune Forum, Jane Goodall Institute, the NGO Committee on Disarmament, Peace and Security, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and Middle Powers Initiative. He is the recipient of the Rutgers University School of Law's Arthur Armitage Distinguished Alumni Award. He has presented expert testimony in the parliaments of Canada and the United Kingdom, as well as the U.S. Congress and the United Nations. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Years ago, I wrote a law review article, and I was arguing in the law review article that, I was arguing in the law review article that there are ethical norms in all civilizations, which when they're violated, instability arises, and when they're honored, stability arises. Every religion has some articulation of the golden rule. Either refrain from harming others as you don't want to be harmed, or affirmatively treat others as you want to be treated. You find this in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam, in the Native American traditions, in Seneca, in Confucius, in Taoism, in Jainism. And nuclear weapons clearly violate this norm. The idea that 9 countries could say these are good for us but not good for anybody else is patently absurd. Imagine if the Biological Weapons Convention said no country can use smallpox or polio as a weapon. But in order to maintain stability in the world, we'll let 9 countries use the plague as a weapon. Well, just intuitively, that's absurd. And the reason it's absurd is that it offends our moral sensibility. Because that moral sensibility comes from our common humanity. And the golden rule comes from that. So one night around 1:30 in the morning, I got a call from Robert McNamara. Now, you realize when you write a law review article and you say the sun's going to come up tomorrow, you have to cite the National Weather Service. It's not good enough to say that it's been happening for billions of years. You need authority. So I made this first premise about the golden rule, and I had a footnote in a law review article. And I got a call. Granoff, McNamara here. Just what? I'm, half asleep. What is it? What is it? Why are you calling? He said, I want to tell you, I'm writing a book called Wilson's Ghost about what I've learned, and I want to cite your footnote. I said, well, you don't need my permission. What footnote is it? It's the footnote about the golden rule. I said, well, that's fair use. You don't need my permission. He said, no. The reason I'm calling you is I want to tell you that until I read it, I didn't know that Buddhists and Muslims had the golden rule. Now, if there's anything that highlights is the importance of interfaith dialogue. It's the importance of knowing what I responded to Secretary McNamara, which was the following. In all due respect, sir, the golden rule does not come from religion. It comes from the architecture of our humanity. It comes from the human conscience, and all people have that. And his answer really floored me. He's in his 80s. I know, I'm just learning this. Now, that to me is a man of wisdom and humility. Anyone in their 80s who's still learning, that's a man of wisdom. Interesting. So I learned a lot from that experience. And so I was been very involved in interfaith dialogue for many years. And I believe that it would be beneficial if we articulated a golden rule for the 21st century. Because although all of the golden rules have a core sense of equality and justice and compassion, they're said a little differently. And when they were stated, you could only injure the people that were your contemporaries. But that's not the case now. We now hold in our gift the future. And the way in which we fuel our cars, the way in which we pursue security, puts the future at risk. That wasn't the case. We have to decide whether we will be the last generation. When Jesus said, "Do unto others," that wasn't, you couldn't melt the polar ice cap. You couldn't do it even if you wanted to. But today we're doing it. We're doing it. When Buddha said it, we couldn't destroy the phytoplankton, our third lung. When Hillel said it, we couldn't use nuclear weapons. So I think we should have a golden rule for the 21st century. Treat the lives and well-being of future generations as we want to be treated. And that all religions could adopt that. So I'm publicly saying I will be promoting this, and I ask all of you to promote this, what I think is a self-evident truism that hasn't been articulated. It shouldn't be identified with any person, and certainly not a person as flawed as me. It's an ought. The power of ought is enormous. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. God, when that was stated, it did not include women, it did not include indigenous people, people of color, nor white men without property. But it had the kernel of that equity in it. And that ought becomes a compass point. And the ought of the golden rule is something we all try to live by, but we fall far short of it. So what? It's true. And just because we're not perfect doesn't reduce the truth of the value of the golden rule. So one of the reasons why religions should be involved in this issue is it violates a core ethical principle of every religion. The second reason why religion should be involved in it, the best quote that I've come across that articulates, at least for me, is from George Kennan. Really odd, you know, I like to cite Robert McNamara, George Kennan, people you wouldn't think would be disarmament people. George Kennan said, the readiness, for younger people, he was the architect of the Cold War theory of containment and associated with hard-nosed, quote-unquote, realpolitik. Not a leftist idealist like myself. He said, the readiness to use nuclear weapons against other human beings, against people we do not know, whom we've never seen, and whose guilt or innocence is not for us to establish, and in doing so to place in jeopardy the natural structure upon which all civilization rests, as though the safety and perceived interests of our own generation were more important than everything that has taken place or could take place in civilization. This is nothing less than a presumption, a blasphemy, an indignity of monstrous dimensions offered to God. That's very strong language. Now I think, are we all culpable of this? Are we all responsible for this? In some way we are, if we're silent. But you know, there's only two people. Over 90% of the weapons are in the hands of the Russian Republic and the United States, okay? So I think about like how two human beings carry the weight of this responsibility. I think that's immoral to put that burden on anybody. But I also think that it highlights how precarious our moment is. When the President of the United States said we're going to invade Iraq and the people of Baghdad will come out with flowers in celebration, my wife said, nah, I don't think so. And when Putin said he was going to invade Ukraine and the people of Kiev would greet the Russians with flowers in celebration, I told my wife, nah, I don't think so. Now you could have asked any cab driver in Baghdad or Kiev, and they would have told you that the invading army would not be greeted with flowers in celebration. And yet, heads of countries with huge nuclear arsenals don't have as much common sense sometimes as cab drivers. And for us to be silent in this predicament of human beings no more wise than any of us with this power, what if Boris Yeltsin was having a bad day when the weather satellite was launched off the coast of Norway in 1995? And the Norwegians told the Russians that this was going to be a weather satellite going up to the North Pole. But it looked like it was going to be an electromagnetic pulse exploded over Moscow and destroying the command and control of Russia. For 8 minutes, the world's fate hung in the balance. And Yeltsin said he wasn't worried because he knew Bill Clinton and he knew he wouldn't do it. In other words, it was the human element of trust that made the difference. And that is the currency of the realm, and that's of inestimable importance. And Dr. Sachs's point of dialogue, debate, discussion, compromise, never dehumanizing the other is core to our going forward. And that is the purview of religion. That religion is a two-edged sword. The first religious statement in the nuclear age was by Robert Oppenheimer, "I've now become death, destroyer of worlds," from the Bhagavad Gita. But wait a minute, what happened when the International Court of Justice addressed the issue? Judge Viramatri cited the Ramayana, in which Lakshmana, the half-brother of Ram, who represents all virtue and goodness, is fighting the evil Ravana, who has stolen his wife. And Lakshmana comes and says, "I have a weapon that can destroy the entire race of our enemies." And Ram says, "By ancient tradition, such weapons are prohibited." By ancient tradition, this is a book from thousands of years ago, by ancient tradition, because it violates the human conscience. And that's the duty of religion, to define the human conscience as sacred, as holy, as transcending national identity, religious identity, all identities, because it relates to the divine. And that's what makes us human, and that's why religions have this particular responsibility in this realm. So Yale University Divinity School published this wonder. They did a conference on the subject, and I brought a whole bunch of these. And the way this got done was, there was George Schultz wrote the intro. There's really Jonathan Shell, may he rest in peace, is in there, and fantastic. So afterwards, I was having dinner with some of the trustees there, and I said, you know, the Norwegian sovereign fund, which they got from the windfall of the oil, is prohibited from investing in enterprises that grossly violate ecology, the environment, violate human rights, child labor, and weapons of indiscriminate effect, landmines, cluster munitions, and nuclear weapons. And this fund has done very well. What are your guidelines for your investments of the endowment of Yale Divinity School? And they said, well, our guidelines are to do what is legally permissible, to maximize profits, so we can have scholarships, quality education, and the good things that we do. And I said, well, that's really good. Now, at that time, I was practicing law. And I had some clients that I did get rid of when I realized what they were doing. There was a bunch of accountants in South Jersey. And they had a company, they were making grossly offensive pornographic films. And I got rid of those clients. I found it really creepy. But they were making 25% on their investment, 25% a year. It was extremely profitable. So I suggested to the trustees there, what do you think? Would you be interested in my putting you together with this film company that makes these pornographic films? Because you'd make a lot of profit. It's perfectly legal under the First Amendment. They were just shocked at the proposition. They said, what? I said, well, I mean, my understanding is you don't feel any constraint in other than the law. This is perfectly legal. And you're not following the guidelines, so it appears to me you're perfectly comfortable investing in enterprises that will destroy the future of humanity, but you're offended by raunchy sex. Is that what is? I'm convinced that if we had a student movement and a movement within churches, synagogues, and mosques to adopt the guidelines of a secular state, Norway, with those three principles, human rights, environment, and disarmament, that we would win that debate. We would win that debate hands down. because that was why I'm recounting this, to encourage what Religions for Peace put forward as the Landau responsible investment proposal, which is that religions should be challenged to invest their resources along the lines of the Norwegian investment. And the reason that's important is not just because it's practical, but it's correct. And it highlights the integration of the unsustainability of inequity toward children. It highlights the concordance of environmental responsibility and nuclear disarmament. And last but not least, nuclear weapons present an institutionalization of adversity that precludes the level of cooperation needed to protect our third love. And so the idea that you would negotiate cooperation while on Monday, and then on Tuesday you're threatening total annihilation over your identity. You're saying, it's Samson, because you're saying, we now know that if 2% of the arsenals were to go off, it would throw enough soot into the stratosphere to destroy the user. So it's not mutually assured destruction, mad, it's going to self-assured destruction, sad. And so it's mad and sad. That's what the science is telling us, and that's the situation that we're in. So I think that if we can get religious institutions to start explaining to people what's at stake, we have to have the energy of the spirit to win this, because nuclear weapons are inherently immoral and illegal. They're illegal because they can't discriminate between civilians and combatants. And they're immoral because they put the very sanctity of life itself, all life, at risk. And that's why this work is so important, and why thank you for convening us.
Golden rule discussion, as well as the talking really about what we owe to the future generations. It reminded me of the indigenous proverb that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So thank you for that. We are basically out of time, but I thought that maybe, Jeff, you have to leave? Okay. Maybe we'll do just one burning question from here, and then anyone online, if you put questions in the chat, we'll try to look at those afterwards. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. So any questions from here? Yes, Terry.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for organizing this panel. This was very inspirational, and I never cease to be amazed by Jonathan's optimism. I've known him for a long time, and I always enjoy listening to you, Jonathan, so thank you very much. I had a comment and a question for Dr. Bartoli, because you mentioned that plutonium produced in nuclear reactors can be used for nuclear weapons. It's not entirely correct. We have 431 nuclear power plants generating electricity, providing 11%. If we are to meet sustainable development goals, if we are to meet climate change goals, we need to rely more on nuclear generated electricity. 10 countries have made nuclear weapons. None of them used plutonium from a nuclear power reactor. They all had dedicated nuclear weapon development programs, and all 10 of them either gave or received assistance from another nuclear weapon state. So the reason why I raise this is that you very correctly mentioned the megatons to megawatts project, the Gorch and American thing, and you provided the details, but there was a similar agreement to also burn plutonium from dismantled Russian and American nuclear weapons. And at that time, I was an advisor to then Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, and this plutonium would have come to Canada to be burned for generating electricity in Canadian CANDU reactors, which is the only reactor that can burn a mixed oxide fuel bundle without any engineering to the reactor. So what I really wanted to point out was that plutonium is generated in nuclear power reactors, but the spent nuclear fuel is safely stored. and it is of a type that's not really useful for nuclear weapons. They would use a plutonium production reactor to make plutonium for nuclear weapons.
So thank you for the question. The debate of plutonium is clearly complicated also on the technical side. I don't think that we have the time here. But I think it's important for us to realize that Frank von Hippel is actually quite clear that the plutonium can be reutilized for the construction of weapons. So you're right that definitely plutonium can be used to create electricity. The problem is, what do you do with the spent plutonium, and how possible it is, different than uranium, to use it anyway? And I agree with you that those who are using plutonium for military purposes are doing that with specific facilities. But it's very important for us as humanity, to capture the difference. Because that agreement that you spoke was never implemented, and it was never implemented for a reason. Because it was not, as Jonathan was mentioning, economically viable the same way the uranium was. Megaton to megawatts made an enormous amount of sense economically. Plutonium, yes, you can do technically MOX and so on and so forth, but costs money and it doesn't produce the same quantity of economic results. And this is why I was calling for a technical solution that actually replicate what we have on the uranium side. So I'm more than happy to speak with you afterwards. I do think that it's important for us, speaking about the next generation, that we are literally poisoning the world with plutonium that didn't exist before 80 years ago, in the same quantity, in the same quality, in the same way.
Just to interrupt, the agreement was not implemented because the Russians and Americans fell apart politically. It was going to be paid for as a non-proliferation and disarmament exercise. It wasn't going to be run on its economics. So
and this is why I'm saying that there is a significant difference, right? We can do things technically, but we can do things very differently, as Jonathan was mentioning before, if it makes sense economically, right? If you take...
But no one is using plutonium to generate electricity today. Who's using plutonium?
Well, the Russians are actually doing
Yeah, but
it.
that's an old thing. It's only Russia. And
Well,
India.
but their claim is actually that you can make money out of that. The question is non-proliferation issues. This is the right place. This is the UN is the right place to have that conversation. Because if you speak with our Russian friends, they would actually argue not only that plutonium can make electricity, but actually we should, as humanity, learn how to use plutonium exactly for that reason.
Can I respond? Could I point something out?
Yes,
point out
very
that,
quickly, because we are out of time.
Tariq, who asked this question, is an expert because he was a senior
officer in the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the debate. The problem is the debate on what we can do with the waste, like the waste material, is what you're talking about. It's marginalized in the media. It's marginalized in the political. Nobody talked about it in the last elections. What they talked about was like maybe 20 trans kids, like 20 of them in the whole country. That got more coverage. So I think that what we just saw is two very, very rational people with different points of view, which was somewhat arcane to most of us, because we don't know. It's arcane to me, and I study this stuff, and I don't know fundamental physics. It might be worthwhile to actually have an actual meeting, an actual debate on the on this subject. That's where I'm going.
That's exactly what I was proposing. This is exactly what I was doing. I'm delighted that we have this reaction. This is exactly what we want.
All right, I think I'm going to have to say goodbye to our online audience and our online participants, and really thank everybody for joining us today. I think this is just the beginning of a very important set of discussions. There is so much that needs to be done, and there's so many groups of people. I love that you brought up young people and faith communities. We need to bring them together. We need to bring them to these conversations, and we need to make a safer place, safer world. Thank you, everyone, so very much. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Audrey.